I should say at the start that I have never told anyone the full version of this. And I'm not entirely sure why I'm telling it now. Maybe because the man I was when it happened is no longer the man sitting in this chair. And I would like to put the older version of myself somewhere I can look at him without flinching. Maybe because my wife asked me last spring why I still keep the headset in the drawer beside the bed. And I gave her an answer I knew was not true, and she let me. That kind of small permission, repeated over years, eventually becomes the shape of a marriage. I think about that more than I should. My name does not matter for this. What matters is that for 26 years, I worked as a maritime distress translator out of a satellite-linked center on the coast of Nova Scotia. And for the last 11 of those years, I worked the overnight desk. I translated Mayday traffic and routine bridge-to-bridge from Mandarin, Russian, Portuguese, and the kind of brittle, half-collapsed English you only hear when a man is standing in water and trying to remember the word for ladder. The job is not glamorous. Most nights are quiet. You sit in a low-lit room with 3 other translators. The heaters click on and off. The coffee tastes faintly of the metal it was made in. And the screens in front of you show the shapes of ships you will never see, moving across an ocean you will never touch. Once or twice a week, somebody on one of those shapes presses a button or speaks into a handset, and your job is to make sure the right people understand them in time. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, because I'm about to describe something that came out of being good at it. Skill is not innocence. I learned that late. The night I want to talk about was the 14th of November, 6 years ago. Cold for that time of year, even on our coast. The wind off the water had that particular dryness that strips the inside of your nose. And the parking lot outside the center had frozen in long ribbons where the snow had melted in the afternoon and refroze at dusk. I remember stepping over those ribbons on my way in because I had new boots, and I did not want to scuff them. I remember that detail because it is the last small vanity I can place before the night changed. And I've learned to mark such things. The men I used to be are easier to find if I leave little flags in the ground where they were last seen. Inside, the shift was ordinary. Marcel was at the next station, reading something on his phone he would not show me. Aiko was on the Pacific desk, headset half off, drawing in her notebook the way she always did when traffic was thin. The supervisor that night was a woman named Halford, who had come up through the Coast Guard and ran the room like a hospital ward, quiet and exact. I logged in at 2200. I checked the active vessel list. I poured coffee. I took the first call at 2217, a Panamanian-flagged bulk carrier whose first officer wanted to confirm a course alteration around weather south of the Grand Banks. His English was clean. I translated nothing. I only noted the exchange and routed it. That is most of the job. You are a relay. You are a piece of glass other people speak through. The signal I want to tell you about came in at 2341. It came on a frequency that was assigned to maritime use, but was not that night, carrying any vessel I could see on my board. The board pulls AIS data, which is the automatic identification system every commercial ship of any size is required to broadcast. If a ship is where it should be, it shows up as a small triangle with a name and a course. The triangle that should have been there was not there. The frequency was live, though. Someone was keying a handset on it. I could hear the small, wet sound of a person about to speak. And then nothing. And then the sound again. 3 times, like someone deciding, I want to be careful here. I want to tell you what I did, not what I think I should have done. I leaned forward. I adjusted the gain. I wrote the timestamp on the pad beside my keyboard, because that is the first thing you are trained to do. And then, because the silence on the frequency had a particular quality that I'd only heard a handful of times in 26 years. I did something I was not supposed to do. I muted my outgoing channel to the floor. I did not call Halford over. I told myself I was waiting for content. I told myself I did not want to pull the room toward a ghost signal. Those were the words I used in my own head. Ghost signal. As if naming it small would keep it small. The voice, when it came, was a man's. He spoke in Russian, but not the Russian of the merchant fleet, which is clipped and full of position language and the names of ports. This was domestic Russian, the Russian of a kitchen. He said, and I'm translating now the way I translated then, with the same words in the same order. I do not know if anyone hears this. I am not on a ship. I am inland. Please. Then he stopped. The frequency stayed open for another 11 seconds. I counted them. I always count in those situations. It is a habit from training. And it is also, I think now, a way of keeping my hands busy when the rest of me would like to leave the room. A distress call from inland is not technically impossible. People sometimes find old marine radios in attics and basements, especially in coastal regions. And a strong enough handset with the right antenna can throw a signal far enough to catch a satellite relay under the right atmospheric conditions. I had heard one such call in 2009 from a hunter in northern Quebec who had broken his leg and could not reach his truck. We had triangulated, alerted the provincial police, and the man had been found within 4 hours. That call had come in on a clearly civilian frequency in plain French, with the speaker's full name offered in the first sentence. This was not that. This was a man in a kitchen, speaking Russian, on a frequency he should not have been on, asking if anyone could hear him, and then stopping. I waited. I told myself I was waiting for him to say more. I told myself that if he said more, I would know what to do. I am not sure that was true. I think even then, in the first minute, I understood that I had already begun to decide. He came back at 23:46. 5 minutes is a long time on a live frequency. In those 5 minutes, I had not called Halford. I had not flagged the channel. I had brought up the propagation map and confirmed that conditions were unusual but not impossible for an inland skip. I had checked the recent solar data. I had done, in other words, the work of a man preparing a reasonable explanation for not having acted yet. And when he came back, he said this: "There is a woman here. She is hurt. The phone does not work. I found this radio in my father's things. If you hear me, please. We are in a house. I do not know the road. I know the river." He named the river. I will not name it here because I have spent 6 years not naming it. And I'm not ready to give it up even now. It is a river in a part of the world I have never been to. It is a real river. I looked at it on a map 2 minutes after he said its name. And I'm looking at the memory of that map now. And I can tell you that there are perhaps 300 kilometers of inhabited land along that river. And that in November, the temperature there would have been well below freezing, and that the nearest emergency services he would have been able to reach by working phone, had his phone been working, were not particularly near. I want to pause here and say something I have not said out loud before. When he named the river, I felt relief. I felt relief because the river was not in any jurisdiction I had any official obligation to. It was not in our service area. It was not even on our continent. The distress protocols I had spent 26 years learning were built around vessels at sea, and around coastal incidents within a defined range, and around bilateral agreements with specific national coast guards. There was no protocol for a man in a kitchen by a river in a country whose emergency services I could not directly contact. calling on a frequency he should not have had access to, in a language only one person on my floor that night could understand without help. Halford spoke functional Russian, but slowly. Marcel did not. Aiko did not. If I called Halford over and handed her the headset, she would hear a man saying something she could half follow, and she would turn to me and ask me to confirm. And I would have to confirm. And then she would have to make a decision. And the decision she would make would involve waking people up and contacting agencies and filing a report and beginning a chain of events whose first link was my name. I am telling you this slowly because I lived it slowly. The whole calculation took perhaps 20 seconds. But it was a complete calculation. I want you, if you are still listening, to try something for me. Try to remember the last time you made a decision that felt like a reflex, and then ask yourself, honestly, whether it was a reflex, or whether it was a calculation you had practiced so many times it had learned to disguise itself. Most of the difficult things I have done in my life were not reflexes. They were rehearsals I'd been running quietly for years, waiting for the day they would be needed. I keyed my outgoing channel back open to the floor at 23:51. I did not mention the Russian signal. I logged a routine atmospheric note instead, the kind we filed 2 or 3 times a shift, indicating unusual propagation on the upper marine band and recommending the channel be monitored for ghost traffic. I use that word, ghost. I filed it under my own login. Halford acknowledged the note with a single keystroke from across the room. She did not look up. The man came back twice more that night. Once at 23:58, when he said the woman's breathing had changed and he did not know what to do. And once at 0:17, when he said simply, in a voice that had gone very flat, that he was going to try to carry her to the truck, even though the truck would not start in this cold, because staying in the house was no longer an option. He did not say why. He did not need to. I have replayed that sentence in my head perhaps 10,000 times in the years since, and I have never been able to decide whether the thing that was no longer an option was the woman dying in the house or something else in the house with them. He did not say. I did not ask. I could not have asked. My channel was muted to him, as it had been all night. He was speaking into the dark, and the dark, in this case, was me. At 0:19, the frequency went quiet. I waited until 0:40 before I logged the channel as cleared and noted that the ghost traffic had resolved. I drank the rest of my coffee. I went to the bathroom and washed my hands twice, which was not a thing I usually did. When I came back to my desk, Aiko had drawn a small bird in the corner of her notebook and was coloring it in with a blue pen. Marcel was eating an apple. Halford was reading the night log. The room had not changed. I had changed, but the room had not. And that disjunction was, I think now, the first crack in the long, quiet thing that happened to me afterward. I finished the shift. I drove home in the dark along the coast road, the way I always did. The sun came up somewhere around Lunenburg, gray and reluctant. My wife was already awake when I got in. She had made oatmeal, which she did on the cold mornings, and she asked me how the night had been. And I said quiet. That was the first lie. It was a small one. I have told it in various forms almost every morning since. I want to stop here and let you sit with that, because the rest of this story is about what that lie did to me over 6 years. And I do not want to rush past the moment it was first spoken. A lie told to a person who loves you and who will believe you is not the same as a lie told to a stranger. It enters the house. It puts its coat on the hook. It becomes part of the furniture. Years later, you cannot tell which chairs were there before it arrived. If you have ever told a small lie to someone who trusted you and then watched, over months, The way that lie quietly changed the temperature between you. You already know what I'm about to describe. If you have not, I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that will land. I'm going to try anyway. I think the trying is part of what I owe. For the first week after that night, I waited for something. I was not entirely sure what. I checked the international news every morning before my wife got up, scrolling slowly through Russian language sites I had bookmarked years ago for work, looking for any mention of the river. I found nothing. I found a story about a frozen pipe in a village school, and a story about a wolf sighting, and a story about a regional governor's resignation, but nothing about a man and a woman in a house, and nothing about a truck that would not start. I told myself this was good. I told myself it meant the man had succeeded in carrying her to the truck, that the truck had started against his expectations, that they had reached help, that the woman had lived, that the man had gone back to his life and put the radio away in his father's box, where it belonged. I built that story carefully. I rehearsed it. I added small details to it, the way you add salt to a soup, until it tasted like something I could swallow. In the second week, I began to notice that I was not sleeping. I had always been a sound sleeper. My wife used to joke that I could sleep through the end of the world, which is a joke that has acquired, in retrospect, a quality I do not enjoy. But now I would lie down at 7 in the morning after my shift, close my eyes, and find myself counting again. 11 seconds of dead air, 5 minutes between transmissions, 26 minutes total from the first keying of the handset to the last. The numbers ran in my head the way a song you do not like runs in your head, without permission, without an off switch. I would get up at noon, 3 hours short, and drink coffee until my hands shook, and tell my wife it was just the change of season. In the third week, Halford asked me into her office. I want to be exact about this, because I have, in the years since, talked myself into and out of several different versions of it. She closed the door behind me, which she did not usually do. She sat down. She asked me how I was. I said I was fine. She nodded. She said the night log from the 14th had been pulled for routine review, which happened to about one shift in 20, and that the atmospheric note I had filed had been flagged by a junior analyst at the regional office who was curious about the propagation conditions that night, because they did not, on closer inspection, match the profile I had described. She said this without accusation. She said the analyst was probably bored. She said it was probably nothing. She asked me if I remembered anything else from that channel. Any voices, any patterns. I had perhaps 4 seconds to decide. I said no. I said I had monitored the channel for 40 minutes and heard nothing but static fluctuation. I said the note was filed because the fluctuation was unusual enough to warrant a record, but that no content had emerged. I said all of this in the calm, slightly bored voice I had spent 26 years cultivating for exactly such moments, the voice that says, I am a professional. I'm not interesting. Please move on. Halford looked at me for what felt like a long time. She nodded. She thanked me. She opened the door. As I was leaving, she said, almost to herself, that propagation that night had been strange across the whole network, and that 2 other centers had logged similar ghost traffic. She did not say whether anyone else had translated any of it. She did not ask me to follow up. I did not ask either. I went back to my desk and I worked the rest of my shift. And when I got home that morning, my wife asked me how the night had been. And I said quiet, and she put her hand on my shoulder as she passed, the way she did sometimes. And I felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of water when you have been underneath it too long. I have asked myself, in the years since, what I thought I was protecting in that office. My job, certainly. My pension, which was 3 years from full vesting. My reputation, which in our small professional world was the thing I had instead of wealth. But I think there was something else, and it took me a long time to name it. I was protecting the version of myself that had walked into the office that morning. The man who had, until that conversation, not yet definitively lied about the signal. Until I said no to Halford, there was still a version of events in which I had simply failed to act in the moment, and might, given the right opening, correct the failure later. After I said no, that version was gone. The man who walked out of her office was a different man than the one who had walked in, and the difference was small enough that no one else would ever see it, and large enough that I would never see anything else. I did not tell my wife about the conversation. I did not tell her about the signal. I did not tell her, in the months that followed, about the dreams, which began in December and which involved, with a consistency I found almost insulting, a kitchen I had never seen, a window with frost on the inside of the glass, and a radio on a table whose dial I could not quite read. In the dreams, I was always the man at the radio. I was never the man on the other end. I would wake with the taste of metal in my mouth, the way coffee tastes in the center late at night. And I would lie still until my wife's breathing evened out again. And then I would get up and stand by the kitchen window and watch the dark. If you are listening to this, and you have ever stood at a window in the middle of the night without knowing why, I want you to know that I'm not going to tell you it gets better or worse. I am going to tell you it becomes a room you live in. After a while, you stop noticing the walls. The first year passed. I want to compress it because the compression is part of what happened. Time, after a thing like this, does not move evenly. There are weeks I cannot account for. There are afternoons I remember in detail so sharp it hurts. I remember, for example, a Saturday in February when my wife and I drove to a hardware store to buy a new latch for the back gate. And the cashier, a young man with a cold, sneezed into his elbow and apologized. And I felt standing there with a $5 piece of brass in my hand, a wave of something so close to grief that I had to sit down in the truck for 10 minutes before I could drive home. My wife asked if I was all right. I said it was the flu going around. She believed me, or she chose to. I'm not always sure now which of those two things she was doing in those years. I think it may have been both at once, and I think she may have been doing it on purpose. And I think that possibility is one of the things I will not be able to ask her about, ever, because to ask would be to admit there was something to ask about. In the spring of the second year, I requested a transfer off the overnight desk. I told the regional office I wanted more daylight, which was a phrase I had heard a colleague use when his marriage was failing, and which I used because it sounded like the kind of reason a reasonable man would have. The transfer was approved. I went on to the day shift in April. The day shift is louder, busier, full of the small bureaucratic traffic of a working ocean. There is less time to think. That was the point. I told myself I was protecting my health. I was protecting my ability to not think about the channel, which is a different thing, and which I knew, even as I filed the transfer paperwork, was the actual reason. The day shift did not help as much as I had hoped. The channel, by which I mean the memory of the channel, did not require silence to operate. It operated in the middle of conversations. It operated while I was helping my wife carry groceries. It operated once, during a retirement party for a colleague named Doucette, while I was holding a paper plate with a piece of cake on it, and someone was giving a speech about service and dedication. And I realized, standing there, that I had begun to cry, very slightly, in a way I hoped no one could see. My wife saw. She did not say anything. She took the plate out of my hand and put her arm through mine and steered me toward the door. And on the way home, she asked me, in a voice that was careful in a way I had not heard her use before, whether there was something I wanted to tell her. I said no. I want to be clear that this was the moment. If there was a moment in the 6 years between the night of the signal and now, when I could have stopped what I was becoming, it was that moment in the car with my wife, with the heater running and the street lights coming on one by one along the coast road, and her hand on the gear shift waiting for mine to cover it, the way it had for 30 years. I said no. I said it was the speech, the retirement, the sense of time passing. I said I was getting sentimental in my middle age. I made a small joke about it. She laughed a little. She put her hand back on the wheel. There is a particular silence that enters a marriage at a moment like that. It is not the silence of a fight. It is the silence of a door being quietly closed by someone who has decided not to make a scene. I heard it close. I knew what I had done. I did not open it again. I think this is the part of the story most people will not understand, and I do not blame them. Most people, hearing it, will want to know why I did not simply tell her. They will want to know what I was so afraid of. They will construct, in their heads, a scene in which I sit my wife down at the kitchen table and tell her about the Russian voice and the river and the muted channel and the lie to Halford. And they will imagine her, because she is a good woman, and they will sense that from the way I have described her. Taking my hand and saying that she understands, that she forgives me, that we will figure it out together, and they will be partly right. She probably would have done something like that. She is that kind of person. But here is what I want you to consider, if you're still with me. The reason I did not tell her was not that I was afraid she would leave. I was afraid she would stay. I was afraid she would absorb the thing I had done into the body of our marriage, the way she had absorbed every other difficult thing over 30 years, and that her absorbing it would make it survivable, and that its becoming survivable would mean it had been, in some final accounting, survivable. And I did not, in some part of myself I could not look at directly, want it to be survivable. I wanted it to remain the thing it was on the night it happened. I wanted to keep it intact. I wanted, and this is the sentence I've had the hardest time forming, even to myself, to keep the man in the kitchen company. In whatever small way a silence kept on his behalf could be said to keep him company. If that does not make sense to you, I understand. It barely makes sense to me. But I have spent 6 years trying to name it accurately, and that is the closest I have come. In the 3rd year, my daughter came home for Christmas. She was 31 then, working as a nurse in Halifax, unmarried, quietly serious in the way she had always been since she was a child. She arrived on the 23rd with a bag of presents and a cold she had caught on the train. We put her in her old room. She slept for most of the first day. On the second day, in the afternoon, while my wife was at the market, she came into the kitchen where I was reading and sat down across from me and said, without preamble, that she had noticed something about me over the past few visits and that she wanted to ask me about it, and that I did not have to answer if I did not want to. I put the book down. I asked her what she had noticed. She said I had become quieter. She said this was not, in itself, alarming, because I had always been quiet. But she said the quality of the quiet had changed. She said it used to be the quiet of a man who was listening. She said it had become the quiet of a man who was waiting. She asked me what I was waiting for. I want to tell you that I told her. I want to tell you that I sat there in the kitchen with my daughter, who was a serious person and a kind one, and that I gave her the story the way I'm giving it to you now, I did not. I told her that I was getting older, and that older people wait for things in a way younger people do not, and that there was nothing in particular she needed to worry about. She looked at me for a long time. She nodded. She got up and made tea. We talked about her work, which she loved and which exhausted her, and about a man she had begun seeing, whom she described in careful, neutral terms that told me she was not yet sure of him. I asked the right questions. I made the right small jokes. By the time my wife came home with the groceries, we had reassembled ourselves into a father and daughter having a pleasant afternoon, and the conversation we had not had was already, in the way of such conversations, beginning to feel as if it had not happened. That night, after everyone was asleep, I went down to the basement where I kept my old work files. I had a box of things from the center, mostly paperwork that should not technically have left the building, but which had migrated home over the years, in the way such things do. I looked through it. I do not entirely know what I was looking for. I found eventually, near the bottom, a printout of the night log from the 14th of November, 6 years earlier. I had not remembered taking it home. It was possible I had not. It was possible my hand had taken it without consulting me, which is the sort of thing hands sometimes do. In my experience, when the rest of the body has decided something, it is not yet ready to know. I sat on the basement floor and read the log. There was my atmospheric note. There was Halford's keystroke acknowledgement. There was the timestamp of the channel clear. There was, in the margin, in my own handwriting, in pencil so light I had to tilt the page to see it, the name of the river. I had no memory of writing it. I had no memory of bringing the page home. I sat on the basement floor for a long time, holding the printout. And I understood, in a way I'd been resisting for 6 years, that some part of me had been keeping a record. Some part of me had not let it go, even while the larger, public part of me had been very carefully letting it go in front of everyone, including myself. The pencil mark was the thing my hand had done, while my mouth was lying. I have thought about that pencil mark almost every day since. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if only to yourself. When you have done something you cannot undo, what does the part of you that knows do, while the part of you that talks is busy denying it? Where does that knowledge go? I used to think it went away. I do not think that anymore. I think it goes into the hands, into the small marginal gestures, into the things you find yourself doing without remembering why. I think it waits. I did not destroy the printout. I want to say that I did, because it would make a cleaner story. But I did not. I put it back in the box. I put the box back on the shelf. I went upstairs, and I got into bed beside my wife, who turned in her sleep and put her hand on my chest the way she sometimes did. And I lay there with her hand on me and thought about the pencil mark and the river and the man in the kitchen. And I did not sleep. In the 4th year, I retired. I had reached full vesting 18 months earlier, but I had stayed on because retiring felt, for reasons I could not name, like a kind of admission. When I finally filed the paperwork in the spring, it was because Halford had retired the previous fall and her replacement, a younger man named Beaulieu, who had come up through the Navy, had begun making the kinds of small operational changes that suggested he was going to look closely at long-standing records as part of a modernization push. I did not want to be in the building when that looking happened. I told myself it was not the reason. I told myself I was tired, that I wanted to spend more time with my wife, that I had earned the rest. All of those things were also true. The truth is rarely only one thing in my experience. It is usually several things stacked on top of each other, with the heaviest one at the bottom, doing the actual work of holding the rest up. My retirement party was small. Aiko was there. Marcel had moved to Montreal 2 years earlier and sent a card. There were speeches. I do not remember what was said in them. I remember that the cake was too sweet, and that the new supervisor shook my hand and said something gracious that he did not entirely mean, and that I drove home with my wife in the passenger seat, and we did not talk for most of the drive. When we got home, she made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she said, in the same careful voice she had used in the car after the Doucette retirement party 2 years earlier, that she hoped retirement would be good for me. She did not say good for us. She said good for me. I noticed the choice. I did not comment on it. If you've been in a long marriage, you know that the small word changes are the ones that matter. A wife who has been saying us for 30 years and begins to say you is telling you something. She may not entirely know she is telling you. She may not want to be telling you. But the word has changed, and the change is the message. And the message, in our case, was that she had begun, without entirely deciding to think of my interior life as a country she no longer had a visa to enter. I do not blame her for that. I had built the border. In the 5th year, I tried to write a letter. I am not going to tell you who it was addressed to, because I'm not sure, even now, who I intended to send it to. It was not addressed to my wife. It was not addressed to my daughter. It was not addressed to Halford, who was by then living in a small house in Cape Breton with a garden she had told me about at her retirement party. It was not addressed to the man in the kitchen, because I did not know his name and I did not know if he was alive. I wrote it, I think, to whoever might one day open the box in the basement and find the printout with the pencil mark and want to know what it meant. The letter began 3 times and ended none of them. The first version was too clinical. It read like a report. The second was too apologetic. It read like a man trying to be forgiven, which I understood on rereading was not what I wanted. The third was something else, something rawer, in which I tried to describe the muting of the channel and the moment of relief at hearing the river's name and the way I had felt, walking out of Halford's office, as if a small door inside me had closed and would not open again. That version got further than the others. It went on for several pages. I stopped writing it on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when my wife came in from the garden with mud on her hands and asked if I wanted lunch. I have not opened the drawer where the letter is since. I know it is there. I know roughly what it says. I have thought, on several occasions, about taking it out and finishing it, or about taking it out and burning it, and I have done neither. The not doing has begun, in recent months, to feel like its own kind of doing. A man who does not destroy a letter he could destroy is making a decision about that letter every day he does not destroy it. He is keeping it for someone. He may not know who. The keeping is the answer to a question he has not yet allowed himself to ask. I want to take a moment here because I'm aware that I have been speaking for a long time, and that some of you may have come to this expecting a story with more shape to it. A clearer arc. A villain, perhaps. A moment of redemption, or at least of catastrophe. I do not have those for you. The shape of what I'm describing is not the shape of a story. It is the shape of a slow erosion, and the erosion is the point. If you have stayed with me this far, I suspect it is because something in your own life rhymes with this. And I would like to thank you for that, quietly. The way one person at a long table thanks another for passing the salt. I am not performing this. I am trying to tell it accurately. The two are not the same, and I'm old enough now to know the difference. In the 6th year, which is to say last year, 2 things happened that I want to describe before I stop. The first was that my daughter, who had married the man she was uncertain about 3 years earlier, and who had, despite the uncertainty, or perhaps because of it, made a steady life with him in Halifax, gave birth to a daughter of her own. We drove up for the weekend after the baby came home. The hospital had released her early because everyone was healthy and there was a bed shortage. I held the baby for the first time in my daughter's living room, in a chair by the window, while my wife stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder, and my son-in-law made coffee in the next room. The baby was very small. She had the focused, unimpressed expression that new babies have, as if she had recently been somewhere more interesting and was reserving judgment on her current surroundings. She looked at me. I looked at her. My daughter, watching from the couch, said something about how she had my eyes, which I do not think was true, but which I accepted because it was the kind of thing daughters say to fathers in such moments. What I want to tell you is what happened inside me while I was holding her. I want to tell you that I felt joy, which I did, and gratitude, which I did, and the particular tender exhaustion that comes from being in the presence of a brand new person whose existence has rearranged the furniture of your own life. But I also felt, underneath all of that, something I had not expected. I felt the man in the kitchen. I felt him very clearly, more clearly than I had felt him in years. I felt him as if he were standing in the next room, just out of sight, listening. I understood, holding my granddaughter, that he had probably had a child too. I had never thought about that before. In 6 years, I'd not once allowed myself to wonder whether the woman in the house was the mother of a child, or whether the man at the radio was a father, or whether anyone, anywhere, had grown up without one or both of them, because I had muted a channel on a cold night in November and gone home and lied to my wife about how the shift had been. I held my granddaughter very carefully. I did not cry, because I have not, since the Doucette party, allowed myself to cry in front of my wife. But I felt something pass through me that I think was the first honest grief I had permitted myself about that night. And I felt it pass. And I felt it settle somewhere in my chest where I knew it would stay. When my daughter took the baby back, I went into the kitchen on the pretext of helping with the coffee, and I stood at the counter for a moment with my hands on the edge of it, and I watched my son-in-law spoon sugar into a cup, and I understood that I was going to carry this for the rest of my life, and that carrying it was the only thing I had left to offer the man in the kitchen, and that this offer was not nearly enough, and that it was, nonetheless, what I had. I want to ask you, if you have made it this far, to think about the people in your life whose existence you have, without meaning to, depended on the silence of others to maintain. We all have some. I do not think anyone reaches my age without having benefited, somewhere along the line, from a door someone else did not open, a question someone else did not ask, a small mercy that was actually a small cowardice wearing better clothes. I am not saying this to make you feel worse. I am saying it because I think the recognition of it is one of the few honest things available to people our age. And I have come to believe that honesty about it is the closest thing to repair we are likely to get. The second thing that happened last year was that I heard from Aiko. She called me on a Thursday afternoon in late September. I had not spoken to her in almost 3 years. She had retired the previous spring and had moved, she told me, to a small town in British Columbia where her sister lived. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. She asked about my wife and my daughter and the new baby. I asked about her garden, because I remembered she had wanted one. There was a pause, and then she said, in the slightly formal voice she used when she was being careful, that she had been going through some old notebooks from the center, and that she had found something she thought I might want to know about. I waited. She said that on the night of the 14th of November, 6 years earlier, she had been on the Pacific desk, and she had logged, in her own notebook, a note about ghost traffic on the Marine band at 2341, which she had heard faintly through her own headset because the propagation that night had been doing strange things across the room. She said she had not been able to make out the content. She said she had assumed I had handled it because she had seen me leaning forward at my station and writing on my pad. And because I was the Russian speaker and the signal had sounded, to her ear, vaguely Slavic. She said she had not thought about it again for years. She said she had found the notebook entry while packing for the move, and she had wondered, in passing, whether I remembered the night and whether anything had ever come of the signal. She said all of this without weight. She was not accusing me of anything. She was a retired colleague calling to share a small piece of professional nostalgia, the way old co-workers sometimes do. She did not know what she was asking. She did not know that she was, 6 years late, opening a door I had spent 6 years not opening. I told her I did not remember the specific night. I told her that we had logged a great deal of ghost traffic over the years, and that most of it had resolved without incident, and that I was sorry I could not be of more help. She said that was all right, that she had just been curious, that she hoped I was well. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, and we said goodbye, and I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with my hands flat on the wood. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that conversation, because the feeling surprised me. I had expected, all these years, that if anyone ever asked me about the night, I would feel fear. I had rehearsed the fear so many times that I had begun to believe it would be the dominant note. What I felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. I felt for the first time in 6 years the possibility that the silence I had built was not as complete as I had thought. Someone else had been in the room. Someone else had heard, even faintly, what I had heard. Someone else had, in her own way, also let it pass. She had let it pass because she had trusted me. I had let it pass because I had not trusted myself. I have thought a great deal since that phone call about the architecture of complicity, not in a grand sense. In the small sense, the daily sense, the sense in which most of the harm done in the world is done by perfectly ordinary people who are each individually doing perfectly understandable things, none of which alone would constitute a moral failure, but which together amount to something none of them would have chosen if they had been asked to choose it directly. Iko trusted me. Halford trusted me. The system trusted me. The man in the kitchen, by the simple fact of speaking into a frequency I happened to be monitoring, trusted me. Each of those trusts was, in its way, reasonable. Each of them met the man I had spent 26 years presenting myself as. None of them met the man I was on that particular night, and the gap between those two men was the room in which everything that followed took place. I am 61 years old. My wife is 60. My daughter is 37. My granddaughter, who will not remember any of this and to whom I will never tell it, is 15 months old and has begun to walk. I retired 6 years ago this spring. The headset is in the drawer beside the bed because I do not know what else to do with it. The printout is in the box in the basement. The unfinished letter is in the drawer of my desk in the room I use as a study. The pencil mark is still on the page. I have looked at it twice in the past year. Each time, I have put the page back without doing anything else. I want to tell you, before I stop, that I have considered more than once sending a copy of the printout to one of the agencies that handles cold case maritime traffic. I have considered writing an anonymous account and leaving it somewhere it would be found. I have considered, in my worst moments, simply walking into a police station and saying, "I want to tell you about a night 6 years ago," and seeing what happened next. I have done none of these things. I will probably not do them. I have come to understand slowly that the version of me that would have done them was the version that existed before 019 on the morning of the 15th of November 6 years ago. And that version did not survive the channel going quiet. What survived was this one. This one writes letters he does not send and keeps printouts he does not destroy, and tells his wife the shift was quiet and stands at kitchen windows in the middle of the night and counts to 11 and then to 5 and then to 26 in an order that is no longer voluntary. There is a particular quality of light on our coast in the late afternoon in November, just before the sun goes down, when the water turns the color of old pewter and the sky behind it goes a kind of bruised green. I noticed it for the first time, really noticed it, the November after the signal. I had driven down to the water on my day off by myself, without telling my wife where I was going. I stood at the end of the breakwater with my hands in my coat pockets and watched the light change. I thought, standing there, about how strange it was that I had lived on this coast for most of my adult life and had never, until that afternoon, looked at the light the way it was actually behaving. I had looked at it, but I had not seen it. I had been busy with other things. I had been busy, I think now, being the man I thought I was. I see the light now. I see it every November. I stand at the kitchen window with a cup of tea and I watch it change. And I think about the river I will not name, and the kitchen I've never seen, and the radio on the table whose dial I cannot read. And I think about the man whose voice I muted. And I think about the woman whose breathing changed. And I think about the truck that may or may not have started. And I think about the silence I filed under my own login, and the lie I told my wife the next morning over oatmeal. And I think about my daughter asking me what I was waiting for. And I think about the pencil mark. And I think about Aiko's voice on the phone saying she had just been curious. And I think about my granddaughter's small, focused face looking up at me from the blanket. And I think about how all of these things are now. In some way I cannot fully describe, the same thing. They are all the channel. They are all the signal. They are all the silence I built and have continued every day for 6 years to maintain. My wife came into the kitchen last night while I was at the window. She did not say anything for a moment. She stood beside me and looked out at the water, which was almost black by then, and she put her hand on my back between my shoulder blades, where she used to put it when our daughter was small and would not sleep, and I would walk her up and down the hallway for hours. She left her hand there for a while. Then she said very quietly that the tea was getting cold and that I should come to bed. I came to bed. I did not tell her anything. I lay down beside her and listened to her breathing even out, and I thought about how, in the early years of our marriage, I used to match my breathing to hers on purpose, as a way of falling asleep. I had not done that in a long time. I tried it last night. I could not quite manage it. My breathing was a little too shallow, a little too quick. Hers was the steady, deep breathing of a person who had decided, a long time ago, to trust the man beside her, and to keep trusting him, and to ask no more of him than he was willing to give. I lay there for a long time. I am still, in some sense, lying there. I expect I will be, in some sense, lying there for the rest of my life. The channel is open. It has always been open. I am the one who has been muted all this time. And the strange thing, the thing I did not understand for years, and am only beginning to understand now, is that the muting was never something done to me. It was something I did. It is something I am still doing. Every morning when my wife asks me how I slept, And I say, fine, I am doing it. Every time my daughter calls and I tell her I'm well, I am doing it. Every November, when the light goes the color of pewter and I stand at the window and do not speak, I am doing it. I do not know how to stop. I am not sure anymore that stopping is what I want. I am not sure what stopping would mean. I think it might mean becoming someone my wife would not recognize. And I have spent 30 years being someone she could recognize. And I do not know who I would be on the other side of that. I think the man in the kitchen, if he is still alive, would understand. I think he might be doing something similar in whatever house he ended up in, with whatever radio he kept or did not keep. I think there are more of us than people realize. I think we are all standing at our own windows in our own Novembers, watching our own light change, keeping our own channels open and muted at the same time, waiting for something we are not sure we want to arrive. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to put this recording away. I do not know what I will do with it. I do not know if I will ever play it back. I suspect I will not. I suspect it will go into the drawer with the headset, or into the box with the printout, or into the desk with the letter, and that it will become one more thing I've kept without being able to say why. But I wanted, at least once, to say it out loud. I wanted to hear my own voice make the shape of it. I wanted to know that the words existed somewhere outside my head, even if no one ever hears them. That has to count for something. I am not sure what. I'm not sure it counts for much, but it is tonight. What I have, and I have learned, over 6 years, to be careful about refusing the small things on the grounds that they are not the large ones. The tea is cold. The light is gone. My wife is asleep upstairs. The coast is dark. The channel is quiet. I am here. I am still here.